Okay.
Sure.
All right. Going live. And okay, we're live. Greetings in the love and in the light of the one infinite creator. I'm Andre, and here with Steve of the St. Angelo of the SRSrocco report, and Dune and Ivor. Now, Steve is going to tell us a little bit about his presentation, and then he's going to do his presentation. Yeah,
Okay,
go
I've
ahead.
been go ahead. Well, I've been following the peak oil, and there's still peak oil. But the devil's in the details. And so what I've done now is the economy's always been
Oh,
about burning energy.
hold on a second. We just it
Sure.
says no data. There was a problem with the stream. Okay, now it says excellent connection. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, so we all know, well, if you've been following the energy situation, there is peak oil, but it's the devil's in the details. And now we peaked in conventional. We're just waiting for the unconventional. And so the issue is the economy has been based on burning energy for thousands of years. We just kind of forgot about the earlier energy and how much we used that energy and how it changed the actual climate and environment. So I want to go back in history because a lot of people tend to look at the energy used in the ancient times as mostly human, animal, and slave labor. No, it was mostly wood fuels. And then to get an idea of what this wood fuel was and how it changed over time. So that's the kind of presentation and how it relates to the economy and assets and money. And so that's going to be the kind of conclusion of the event, of this presentation. It's about an hour, so I hope I can get it done quicker than that.
Right.
Sounds good.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share screen,
Mm-hmm. Sounds good.
and I will pick.
The entire screen. Yeah.
Okay. Well, the first slide you're looking at is a simplification of the last 2,000 plus years of world population growth versus global oil production. And we could see the oil production is in the red line. It came on relatively late in the human experience. So most of the growth of previous civilizations and medieval civilization is from the birth zero to about 1700. That was world population was slow growth due to expansion based on wood fuel. And then England started to figure out how to smelt metals, iron especially, with coal instead of wood. And that's how they became one of the leading empires and powers from about 1700 to 1900s. And then we brought on oil. And so this is how the population increased, and this is how energy has changed over time. Now, I did a presentation for my subscribers called The Late Bronze Age Collapse, Amazing Parallels
Oh,
to the Coming
um,
Collapse.
I think you may have selected the window. We're still seeing the first slide instead of the full screen.
Okay, let's see here. Okay, let me get out.
So yeah, try unsharing and then share the entire
All right.
screen so that we can see your full screen presentation.
All
As
right.
that's
Sorry about this. Let's do
that's
this
all right.
again. Entire screen.
That's right. That's what I was saying. Mm-hmm.
Okay. My apologies. So
It's okay.
let's you can see it now, correct?
Let me see. Yeah. Okay. Now I see it full screen. Yep. Mm-hmm. That's the first
And
slide.
do you see the next slide?
Yes, I see the second slide. Very good.
Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
So I did this presentation called The Late Bronze Age Collapse, Amazing Parallels to the Coming Collapse of the High-Tech Global Economy. And there's some very interesting parallels between the Late Bronze Age and what we're seeing today, because during the Late Bronze Age, there was two Bronze Ages. There was the early, which started about 3000 BC, and then the late, which was 1700 to 1200 BC. What we had then was we had a micro global economy, just like the G7 or the G10 or the larger countries today. It was the Aegean, the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Canaanites, Cypriots, the Mitanni, Syrians, and Babylonians. And what's interesting, there was a lot of trade, a lot of different goods and services, raw materials were traded between these civilizations. So it was kind of a just in time, but it was a slower, let's say a slower just in time inventory system based on sailboats. Now, this is the ancient late Bronze Age trade routes. And what we could see is basically we see the trade come from Egypt up through the Babylonians, right by Cyprus, which Cyprus, the word Cyprus comes from the ancient Greek word of copper. So that's where the word Cyprus came from. And so it was a major producer of copper during the Bronze Age. And then we could see it move to the different regions. So this was the global supply chain. It was bronze that was made from copper and tin, 9 parts copper, 1 part tin. So a major area of the late Bronze Age copper production was the enchymy. And what we could see on the ancient Cyprus copper sites, the big dots are where they found a lot of ancient slags for copper production. And then enchymy, this was the ruins of it found in a Natural Geographic article. So Cyprus was a major exporter of copper, just like Chile is today. Now, to get an understanding, what we need to understand today, we burn coal, natural gas, and other electricity, mostly coal, to smelt metals. That's the way it's done now. Back then, it was you took wood, you made charcoal, and you smelted copper. So during 1 year in ancient Cyprus, the wood and charcoal consumption to do 50 metric tons, which isn't a lot, was about 200,000 trees. 200,000 pine trees or 6,000 acres per year, which was 8 to 10 square miles of forest. Now we have to remember copper wasn't the only thing they used wood for. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And I got this information, the data, from this 448-page study from Michael Jones, which he did back in 2007. And this was the data used to calculate wood charcoal consumption for smelting copper sulfide on Cyprus. So I did a lot of research to get a good estimate of how much wood was consumed during the late Bronze Age, and especially during the peak of the late Bronze Age. So I took some liberties to do an estimate, and during the ancient entire late Bronze Age civilization, wood and charcoal consumption to produce copper for 50-year period. This was during the peak, which I put about 1300 BC. The collapse happens after that, about 1250 BC. So to do 40,000 metric tons of copper in 50 years in the entire Bronze Age civilization, they cut down 160 million trees. This is the size of about 8,000 to 10,000 square miles of forest. Now, they also smelted silver, they smelted gold, they made pottery, they cooked, everything was used for cooking, and then they had shipbuilding and then construction. The amount of trees that were cut down during the late Bronze Age, it's astronomical, and it's even worse during the Roman Empire. And a lot of people, a lot of archaeologists, a lot of people who study history, the collapse of these or the rise and fall of these ancient civilizations, I never hear them talk about wood fuel. And so I've learned from my research, and this is my analysis, is that part of the peak and collapse of these ancient civilizations was due to their peak of production of wood fuel and the falling energy return on investment of their wood fuel production.
Yeah. Uh,
Now,
I just wanted to make a point for those who may not be aware that the reason they added tin, to my understanding, is to melt the lower the melting point so that they wouldn't need to use as much fuel per unit of metal. Is that right?
correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and you see the interesting thing about bronze is it changed the way that humans expanded on the earth, because in the Stone Age, using fire and animal husbandry didn't impact. It did, but using bronze, making bronze axes, then you can cut down a lot more trees. And so this was a huge trend change in the way humans expanded and change their environment. Now, Mycenaean Greece, which is part of the late Bronze Age, the island of Delos is a typical example. This is a typical example of deforestation, soil erosion, and collapse. There is a close interconnection between the mined cities and mined land. The fact that the broken statues and scattered column drums of centers of ancient civilization have deforested and eroded landscapes as their settings does not seem to be an accident. The general impression of synchronicity that the contemporaneous ruin of ancient societies and ancient civilizations has been inescapable. And this is the Mycenaean city or island of Delos. And we can look here. Here's the small island of Delos. It was really a pretty big deal. It's kind of where the rich and famous went, kind of like in the Cayman Islands of today. This is where they went during the late Bronze Age, even during the Greek Empire and Roman Empire. So the ancient Greek island of Delos location right here, and its artist rendering of what it looked like between 900 BC and 100 AD. Now, this is a close-up. And what people don't realize when they go to the Mediterranean, especially in Greece and in Italy and other areas, is that there's a lot of the Mediterranean is denuded. Even in France and Spain, a lot of it is denuded. And what's interesting, the forests changed over thousands or hundreds and thousands of years. They changed. What used to be deciduous and coniferous forests with different kinds of trees turned, now they're like a desert scrub.
Mm-hmm.
And this is part of the process. Now, getting to this first section, the late Bronze Age collapse of the micro global economy in the Mediterranean was based on these major factors. The falling EROI of wood fuel caused a peak in copper tin production, shipbuilding for commerce, resulting in economic decline across the entire late Bronze Age empire. Number two, deforestation of lowlands and mountains caused massive erosion of increased local drought conditions.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people don't understand. You cut down trees, you change the rainfall.
Yeah, it's true.
50% of the weight of trees cut down contained water, acted as water storage and moderated the climate. And then I'm probably, reconfirming these things you already know. Over farming also caused massive erosion, silting of local harbors, ports, and eventual famine. And then what really turned it over, what the collapse is earthquakes, droughts, internal conflict, and outside attack from the sea peoples. But I do believe the weakness happened due to the deforestation, peak of wood fuel production, and then the problems with a drought and soil erosion, famine. And then the thing started to decline. Many of you heard about the late Bronze Age Battle of Troy, and the 1250 to 1185 BC. And what we have here is a graphic representation of the Mycenaean Greek victory over Troy, likely due to economic control of the Black Sea trade of wood and tin in that area. So what's interesting about Troy, they really couldn't find out. They really didn't understand Troy until more recently. This is an artist rendering of ancient Troy about 1200 BC. Here's the city of Troy here. We've got the Trojan Harbor, and then you can see the mountainous peninsula, which is also shown in this computerized graphic on the left. Now, this is the ancient city of Troy, or it was first known as Troia, and how the bay silted over for 6,000 years. You go back to about 6,000, 6 or 7,000 years ago. Here is Troia right here. You could see it right on the bank.
Yep.
This is what the bay looked like. Now, when the Greeks attacked Troy, it had silted in over those thousands of years due to early Bronze Age and cutting down trees.
Mm-hmm.
Humans were doing that already. And so they changed the landscape in these 1,000 years. And then if we look at what Google shows, what the ancient Trojan Harbor would look like, Troy was about 1.25 miles away from the coast when the Greeks attacked. but this is what it looks like today.
Wow.
So this is typical in so many areas around the world. And so I just want people to realize this is an ongoing process. And so uh, and they're using it for farmland now.
Yeah, they're not growing
Now
trees.
getting no, they're not growing trees, and that's one of the issues for a lot of the problems we're seeing today. Now I'm going to go to the next stage, and then I'm going to get into the modern times. Ancient Roman energy cliff and the currency debasement. Why connecting the energy dots is important for today. Now, most people that I talk to when I talk about the silver denarius and the collapse of the Roman Empire, the knee-jerk reaction is it was the debasement of the silver denarius, the collapse, hyperinflation, or the debasement of the currency. And so people are blaming the emperors for doing this. It was their fault. They were bored. They had nothing better to do but debase the currency. Well, there's a reason they debased the currency. Now, according to C.C. Patterson, did a pretty interesting research on what was the approximation of the silver production during the ancient Roman Empire. And from this 50 BC to 100 AD period, they estimate about 200 metric tons a year were produced. And at that time, there was about 10,000 tons of silver stocks in the Roman Empire. So in doing more research, I found that the ancient Roman Empire wood and charcoal consumption to produce silver in this period, 50 BC to 100 AD, 200 metric tons, 400,000 metric tons of charcoal, 2 million metric tons of wood, which is about 50,000 acres of hardwood, 80 square miles, just for 1 year. Again,
Wow.
silver and lead were only part of what they were smelting. They smelted a lot of iron, copper. They also smelted gold. So this is just part of the wood consumption. And then for the 50-year peak, and this was the peak of the Roman Empire, 50 to 100 AD, to do 10,000 metric tons in that period is 100 million metric tons. So this was 4,000 square miles of forest. And of course, forests regenerate. They do. I get that. But during this period, the population was increasing. And as they cut down forest, they were using it for farmland.
And
So
and
a
they
lot
weren't
of
planting
times,
trees.
and they weren't planting trees. And so, and then it's interesting when you look at some of the ancient texts about what happened, in Italy, the Roman legions that were going into the northern part of Rome early on, they were afraid to go in these forests. Well, they cut down those forests to use for fuel. And
Hmm.
so they were so immense. And the same thing with North Africa. I'm doing a study on North Africa from Morocco all the way to Algeria and Tunisia. There was massive forests there, massive
Wow.
forests that are gone now.
Hmm.
And the amount of wildlife, the amount of lions, tigers, hippos, all these, they had the same wildlife in North Africa they do in South Africa or Middle Africa. The Romans used those in the Colosseums. They must have killed
Yeah, I
tens of thousands.
I heard that a few thousand years ago, what is now the Sahara had lots of trees and shrubs and lakes and rivers, and well, now and it was the breadbasket of Rome, and then now it's
Yes.
just a big desert.
Yeah, and so yeah, interesting. I corresponded with the woman because she wrote an interesting article. She, she lives in France and they have an olive orchard, so she studied olive production history. So she traveled all over the world, went to Algeria, and to like middle Algeria. There's a Tbilisi is the name of this town, and she heard that there was a large ancient Roman oil press. So she went 50 kilometers south, in the middle of the desert,
Hmm.
and to her astonishment
Hmm.
she found what was the largest Roman oil press in the empire, in
Wow.
the middle of a desert. So not only did they grow grain there, they grew they
Olives.
harvested a lot of olive oil, which is now a desert. And so what's interesting, you go back to the Depression in the United States, you look at what happened in the Midwest or the Western. We had the Dust Bowl, right?
Hmm. And that was from
Well,
overtilling.
that's what happened, in Algeria
Yep.
and much of North Africa.
Hmm.
But the difference is we were able to use fossil fuels to tap into underground water
Hmm.
in the Ogala aquifer in the United States. And so we were able to continue using that for cropland, but it went to became a desert. So
Oh,
this
and
is what we need to understand.
I just
This is
wanted
what we need to understand.
to
Go ahead.
add a clarifying point to the previous slide, that my understanding with the trees is that you have the trees and then you have the charcoal, because the trees are burned down to charcoal, and then from that charcoal you smelt the silver,
Metal.
the metal, right?
Yeah. They take the wood, they put it in, and they make these big piles, and then they burn it slowly, and it makes charcoal. And because wood burns differently than charcoal, charcoal burns at a more moderated, higher basis. And then going to charcoal, you get rid of a lot of water. And so that's the reason why that was the ancient technology, was taking wood, making charcoal, and we smelted all our metals up until 1700 with wood.
Mm-hmm.
And England totally changed that and went to coal. And that's why England became the head of the world. The UK Empire, the English Empire, it was like 150 years due to they had a 50-year technological advancement against the rest of the world on smelting coal, metals from coal. And then the rest of the world finally figured it out. And that's why the United States became so big, is due to all the coal in the Northeast and then the oil in the 1900s. But in this slide,
Mm-hmm.
this is the ancient Roman energy cliff, I call it, and currency debasement. And so what we see is this is estimates of forest clearance in Central Europe, Germany, and northeastern France. And I don't know if many of you have seen the movie Gladiator, the first scene is when Russell Crowe, the general, is in this movie, and it takes place in this massive forest. The reason why they were in a massive forest, that's where the wood was. And so what you see here is the forest clearance, and then after about 120 AD, it collapses.
Oh,
And so this is the collapse period of the Roman Empire. And
200. Yep.
coincident,
Mm-hmm.
coincidentally, this chart it starts at 31 BC, goes to 100 AD, 200, and then after. As the collapse of the wood fuel production occurred, so did the collapse of silver production, and they had to put less silver in the coins because they were still maintaining a very large Roman Empire of 1 million people in Rome. So the debasement wasn't due to the emperors trying to figure out how to use less silver. It was forced on them. And so what I'm trying to get people to understand, from the late Bronze Age to the ancient Roman Empire, the energy comes first, the economy comes second.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you have humans, labor, slave labor. There's a lot of slave labor in ancient Rome. But the energy was really the wood energy, that powerful fuel for cooking, for smelting. That was what drove these ancient civilizations.
Mm-hmm. So
And
they had to add, just to explain for why less wood. It's because they were adding lead and things that had a lower melting point than silver. Is that my?
why there was less silver?
Yeah. Is that why? Well, because they had less wood, or
The reason why is you have to think about. Do you remember that chart I showed? The first chart I showed with the exponential increase in the population
yeah. Mm-hmm.
and the exponential increase in oil production.
Mm-hmm.
Each of these civilizations went through that same cycle.
Mm-hmm.
No one today is going around trying to say, listen, we got to conserve this oil. It's not going to last forever. We have to conserve these resources. They did the same stupid thing we're doing today. They did it back then. They didn't consider, should we continue to expand these populations, cut down more trees? So even though trees regrow,
Mm-hmm.
when you have drought, and that's why you have a collapse, because they cut so many trees down at such a fast rate, because you've got so many more lumbermen, you have so many more coppersmiths, you pushing the population up, you're consuming so much more wood, it reaches a zenith, and then the collapse happens.
Mm-hmm.
It's not only the overall production, it's the energy return on investment. The further you go to get more wood, it's not economic to
Yes.
transport that wood.
Hmm.
And so that's another issue that I could spend hours talking about. But what's interesting, I didn't know about this 2 years ago. I was clueless about how much wood was used until one of my subscribers said, Steve, you gotta check out the Forest Journey. And so the wood and decline of the Roman Empire. Rome financed its growth largely with silver extracted from Spanish ore. Production increased considerably in the first years of the empire, but this was accomplished only by great expense to the Iberian woodlands, since silver smelting furnaces consumed more than 500 million trees during the 400 years of operations. And remember, this is only for silver. We have to multiply it by 5 to 10 times for everything else: shipbuilding, cooking, heating all the baths in all the Roman empires. That was a tremendous
Oh,
amount of
wow.
wood to heat
Yeah.
all these baths. So you start figuring out it was these ancient Roman Empire was a massive wood production, massive. And it also was deforestation. So around the 2nd century AD, the inevitable occurred: silver production declined. Further output was limited not by the supply of ore, and this is important. The ore was there, even though maybe the quality of ore had declined, which we're seeing today,
Hmm.
but which remained abundant, but the accessibility of the wood fuel. And so this is the problem with ancient Rome. This was the problem with the late Bronze Age. And we have to understand, by cutting down so many trees at such a quick pace in a 50-year peak period, it also changes the rainfall, which makes more drought, which destroys crops or
Yep.
floods. And so it becomes a self-reinforcing loop that is not good for high amounts of population in a let's say a small area, especially
Yep.
in Rome.
Hmm. A feedback loop.
Okay, exactly. So now I'm going to move all the way forward to world population moves higher exponentially due to the expansion based on petroleum. I'm going to skip coal because it was only a brief period. But if you show this chart to any math professor or scientist, their knee gut reaction is this is not sustainable. So when I hear people telling me, no, we're gonna, humans are smart, they're gonna figure this out. Well, if you go back in history and you open a history book, well, they couldn't figure it out.
Hmm.
They did the same thing. We're just doing the same thing on a much larger scale and at a much more leverage. So I was invited to speak at the Silver Symposium in Caesar's Palace this last October. And I talk about the energy cliff and the inflated financial assets are 10 times the physical economy. And I'm going to get into that.
Wow.
But there's a lot of debate and discussion about the falling energy return on investment. This is just my kind of gauge that as the reason why we're going to hit the energy cliff, even though we're going to peak and decline, the cost to produce that oil on the other side is going to be much more expensive than the stuff on the left side of the peak. That's why, Russia's going to the Arctic. We're going to deep water. People say there's a lot of abiotic oil. If that was true, which Russia is one of the big Russian geologists or Russian scientists are
Well,
one of the big
they they tried
proponents.
they tried it, but they couldn't get to
They
it.
they can't. And if you look at most, it's what's amazing. A lot of the oil that's being produced by Rosneft and uh, they're drilling more horizontal wells than ever.
Hmm.
And so if they believed it themselves, they'd be going deep. They're not.
Yeah.
So to
I
keep
read
things, I call it.
a book that explained it very well. Like one of this abiotic oil theory is like that oil is the most abundant liquid in the world, but it's actually magma is the most abundant. And if oil
Yes.
or gas gets too close to that magma, it just falls apart into its component particles. So oil will turn into natural gas, and natural gas will just turn to like carbon monoxide, nothing, because when it's too hot, it just gets burned up.
And you see, that's the logic. You said it because if if you go down deep and where they say the abiotic oil is produced, you don't take those particles, natural gas, and make oil. oil makes all those other, you can't reverse the refining process. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what people don't, these people who push the abiotic oil theory don't understand the logic of that. And
Mm-hmm.
so there's no coincidence that you've got the tar sands, oil sands, close to the surface of in Alberta, because it needed millions and millions of years more of compaction, and then of course heating, and it just didn't get time to do that. But moving forward, it I showed how important wood fuel was, and then charcoal. Energy drives the global economy. Energy, oops, I'm sorry, lost my earpiece. Energy has always driven economies, ancient and modern. Financial markets are supposed to steer the economy, and gold and silver are stores of energy equivalent value and have been. Nothing's changed for thousands of years, except the perception of what money is. Now, you've probably seen this chart, but just to review it, Jean-Marc Jancovici did a presentation in front of the OECD in September 2019 showing there's a direct relationship between energy and economic growth. And we got total world oil consumption, 3-year average, and total world GDP per capita. So this is common sense when you understand this information. So I just wanted to share that. I took that information and I did my own analysis for the US. This is total real US GDP based on 2012 chain dollars, public debt, which is in red, and then the energy consumption is in yellow, and it's in quadrillion BTUs. What you'll notice from 1950 to 1980, when we were a real physical economy, that GDP was increasing at the same rate the energy consumption was, and the debt really wasn't increasing all that much. Then we had the big price spike of oil in the 70s. Then we had the recession, and we could see energy consumption falling, and then it started moving up, but then it plateaued right here
Mm-hmm.
in like 95 to 2008. Look what the debt was going up in the United States. So you could see from 1980 to 2008, the GDP was increasing more aligned in tandem with the debt. After the 2008 financial crisis,
Mm-hmm.
the debt shoots up and the GDP is going up, not as quickly, but it's going up. It's not based on the energy growth.
Mm-hmm.
So what's happened is that I believe the global economy hit really kind of died in 2008. That's when we had the massive heart attack. And so we've added all this debt, lowered interest rates to zero, made tight oil economic, and they added a lot of debt to produce that tight oil. And so we have kind of kicked the can down the road and continued business as usual due to this massive amount of debt. So I just wanted to show you that chart. And
Mm-hmm.
to kind of confirm how important energy is to the economy, this is a U.S. average oil production for each decade, an average percentage increase from the 1910s to 2010s. And we all hear about the roaring 1920s. You see images about it. You know, it was the dancers, the flappers. It was an amazing time to be in the United States. The reason for that had to do with the massive increase in oil production. It went up 154% in that decade.
Wow.
So if you look at that little table on the left, it's going to show you global car production. And you're going to notice in 1924, the US was producing 3.6 million autos, and in 1928, 4.3. We produced 84% of all the cars in the world in that period, and everybody else was 16. So now you got cars, you got trucks, you need roads, you need businesses, you need hotels. So the energy came first, even though there was a lot of ingenuity to use that energy. I get that. You can have all the ingenuity you want. If you don't have the energy to back it up,
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to have the growth.
Yep.
So, so this is what's important for people to understand, that it's all based on the energy. And the U.S. was the global oil superpower during World War II. And to tell you the truth, I had no idea until I did the research that in 1940, the U.S. produced 71% of all the oil in the world. I had no idea. I knew it was a lot. I just didn't know. And so when you're producing that much oil and you go into World War II, it was the reason why the Allies, the US and Allies, won the war against Japan, Italy, and Germany was due to the energy. Because At the end of World War II, we had 6,768 military ships and transport ships. It's just unbelievable. And today we only have 470. So we were producing 2/3 of all the oil in the world. And that was the reason why the US and allies were able to win the war. Always about the energy. And so it comes to these kind of charts that you all are familiar. There's two very interesting things about this chart. First of all, if you look at the silhouette of this chart, it doesn't look like there's any peak oil, because I believe this is going to go up even higher in 2023. So if you look at this, people say it's no peak oil, but the important oil is the conventional, which is in that olive color. And then we've got the condensate in white, we've got the heavy oil, tight oil, mostly US, and then we've got the NGLs. What's interesting is we had this massive increase in conventional, mostly conventional oil from 1960 to 1970, 24.6 million barrel a day increase. That's more than 100% increase. We only had 20.2 in 1960. And guess what? The Texas Railroad Commission kept the price of oil at $1.80. For a whole decade,
For
the
a
price
gallon.
of oil.
Oh, barrel. Oh, barrel. Wow.
For a barrel of oil was
Wow.
$1.80. And so, and you know why this is fascinating? If we look at what's happening recently, we had the Russian-Ukraine war, we had the pandemic shutdown, we have all these geopolitical events, right? And so what's happened to the oil price? It went negative, right? Price of oil went negative in 2020, and then it went to 120 during the Russian-Ukraine war.
The
So
start of it.
it's
Yep.
very volatile.
Mhm.
Now, if you go back to 1960, did we have geopolitical events? We had the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963.
Mhm.
No, in 1961, Cuban Missile Crisis. We had the assassination of JFK. We had the assassination of Martin Luther King, assassination of Robert Kennedy. We had the 7-day Arab-Israeli War. We had the Vietnam War. All that didn't do a thing to the price of oil. Nothing could impact the oil, because we were bringing so much oil supply on. It was kind of flooding the market. Most of that was coming out of the new fields in the Middle East. And so that's the reason why it was $1.80 a barrel. But you'll notice, you can ask a question, I just want to finish here. You'll notice the conventional peaked, according to my data that I get from ASPO France, which is Jean Le Herrera, who is now 93 years old. He sent this chart to me that it peaked 70.3 million barrels a day, and it's been declining ever since. And so this is the high quality oil. This is the high energy return on investment oil. This is what produces the much needed diesel that runs the global supply chain. Even though we're making it up with this other petroleum, you can really not refine economic diesel and jet fuel. And if you want to replace or repair your asphalt roads, you need heavy or medium grade oil. So even though we're making it up with this other energy sources, the other petroleum sources, the problem is we're going to get into trouble with the conventional, and that's the higher quality oil. So one thing that I believe is missing from the equation, and it stuns me that a lot of peak oilers, a lot of very smart, intelligent people in the oil industry, is they're ignoring the Red Queen syndrome. And what I've done is I went back and I took my estimated natural decline rate of oil production. And in 1965, we were producing about 31.8 million barrels a day. The natural decline rate was 1.3 million. That was lost every year. And as you go up, we're producing more oil. In 2019, it was nearly 95 million barrels a day. The natural decline rate, conservative, is 10.5 million barrels a day now. That's a Saudi Arabia.
So what is the annual oil decline rate? Is that like how much we don't have in reserves, or what do you mean by that? What does that mean?
That is, okay, I'll give you a perfect example. And I don't have the charts. I didn't want to put too many charts. The shale oil industry's natural decline rate is between 43 and 45% a year. If next year they don't add any wells, it declines to about 3.2, 3.5 million barrels a day. It's gone. It's gone.
Oh.
So what happens is this. there are different. They call them decline rates, but I call it the natural decline rate, and that's if you don't add
Oh, if you
any
don't add.
new, if you don't do any new drilling exploration. The problem is, people say we can get up to 105 million barrels a day. We can push it. The further you push that production, the higher the decline rate.
Mm-hmm.
Because right now, what is known is it's about 6-7% for the large fields, like in the Middle East and around the world. It's 6-7%.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. is 43%.
Yeah.
Offshore is in the teens. So here's what we've done.
Mm-hmm.
We have gone from major fields that decline slower, and we have added new production offshore, deep water, and now shale that declines faster. It's called the Red Queen syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
No one is considering this. So the U.S. is losing between oil and natural gas liquids it's like 4.5 million barrels a day is lost every year from just the United States. That's half of this. And this is conservative. It could be upwards of 11 to 12. Of course, they're going to do more exploration. They're going to do more wells. But guess what? They're not really finding much more.
Mm-hmm.
And, even though they are finding more oil, and so this is the issue. We have to continue to replace 10 to 11 million barrels a day each year. And I believe my analysis suggests after 2025, that's going to get increasingly difficult to do that. We may grow, especially if we have a recession, we drop demand, we drop production a bit. We could be in a plateau for a while. But after 2025, I think these natural decline rates are going to start kicking in.
I know John Peach did a presentation, and he's saying there's just not much more to discover. There's like another 30 billion barrels they can discover, but that's in speculative or probable reserves. And in terms of the peak, I know Art Berman was saying 2027 NGLs will probably peak.
And again, here's the interesting thing. We can debate about when, and I call it circa 2025,
Mm-hmm.
and that's really due to U.S. shale, because I should have included this chart from like 1997 to 2008. There was 11 and a half, 12 million barrels a day of growth, and that all came from the rest of the world, not the U.S. and Canada. After the 2008 financial crisis to 2019, it flipped. Virtually very little growth came from the rest of the world. It mostly came from shale oil and Canada as they ramped up their oil sands. So 85% of that growth came from U.S. shale. And if we understand simple logic, where does the GDP come from? It comes from the energy. We have to thank the U.S. shale industry for allowing the economic growth to continue. And again, we've got to realize, well, that's a two-edged sword, because that declines between 43 and 45% a year. Now, those decline rates are going to slow down to 42, 40% as these long tails hit. But this is another issue that, and I talk about this in detail and do this analysis on my website. But one of the things, and I'm getting close to the conclusion here, one of the things we need to understand, and maybe you all know this, it is common sense. The clean energy transition, not. Green energy is a fossil fuel derivative. And so when you look simply, and this data comes from BP Statistical Review, when you look at the data from 2005 to 2022, the majority of the growth was natural gas, coal, and oil. And this is in terawatt hours. And then followed by wind and solar. Nuclear was actually negative. And I see that trend continuing, even though China is going to try to add more. China's in serious trouble as an economy and high-tech civilization. So when you put it all together, I'm going to call it fossil fuels. It makes it simple.
Mm-hmm.
2/3 of the growth came from fossil fuels. So you needed, and green energy, you really needed a chunk of that fossil fuels to make green energy. So if we're going to start getting into trouble with fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, coal, then it's going to be very difficult to continue ramping up green energy unless we do mandates to cut down luxury, like going on cruises. That's the only way you can do it. And so green energy is really a fossil fuel derivative. And so this is why I don't see really a transition. I think green energy can mitigate fossil fuel usage for a while, but it's going to come back to hurt us. And I talk about that in 5-10 years or more. So putting it all together, the modern, fragile, high-tech global semiconductor supply chain, because it all comes down to the semiconductor. That's what does everything for us now. It's the semiconductor. The typical semiconductor travels 25,000 miles. And you
Wow.
can only do that with energy, with oil. You can't do it with coal. You cannot make an EV super tanker or EV tanker or a container ship cannot be run on electric current. It can't be. And so this is the problem. We cannot really transition to an electric-based transportation system. If we wanted to try to attempt to do that, we should have done that decades ago. So this is the problem. And I did a whole presentation just on the semiconductor supply chain, because we have to understand when Taiwan Semiconductor opens a brand new massive fab plant, it's got a huge specialized gas refinery almost next to it. They've got to refine these gases at like pure 99.999% to
Wow.
make these very small semiconductors. So when they have this massive fab plant that pumps out these semiconductors, people think its technology is efficient. It isn't. What they fail to realize, there's a 2,500 supply chain, so the semiconductor fab plant is the head of a 2,500-mile snake supply chain. And you need that entire supply chain to keep that fab plant running, because those things run out. You've got to continue to replace parts. And so once you get it built, yes, you can pump out these very small components, but it needs a very complex global supply chain to continue making that possible. And unfortunately, as we start to get in trouble with energy, I think a lot of this high tech is going to be problematic. So to kind of pull it together, the modern global economies are extremely dependent upon open trade of high-tech products, services made from oil, natural gas, coal production, base metals, rare earth metals, and lithium. The late Bronze Age economies were extremely dependent on open trade of advanced products from wood fuel, charcoal, copper, metal, tin production, and other raw materials. So they were both very dependent. And when the supply chain broke down in the late Bronze Age, the entire civilization broke down. And the only one that survived of those eight was Egypt for a little bit longer.
Oh wow.
Egypt
Yeah.
was the only one that survived after the collapse of the late Bronze Age. So this is where I want to put it all together now. Kind of compare the energy to the GDP to the problem most people are facing and don't realize it. This is total global financial asset growth versus global GDP and total world petroleum consumption, 2007 to 2022. Simply, I put everything at zero. We just started at zero, and I have shown you what the changes are as of 2022. We added 13.1 million barrels a day of consumption. And look at the GDP, it's 28.1 trillion. Now we're supposed to see an equal amount of GDP based on energy, but that's being inflated due to the debt. But
Hmm.
what's worse, according to the FSB, the Financial Intermediation Report in 2022, we've added 281 trillion in financial assets. So if you take the financial assets and divide it by the GDP, it's 10 times the growth.
Yeah. Wow.
And this is my keep it simple, stupid analogy. We have just enough energy. We burn about 100 million barrels a day of oil and, of course, coal and natural gas. We burn that energy just to produce the GDP, make all the goods and services, transport them, and trade them. That's all the energy we have.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, the financial market doesn't realize we don't have the energy to settle. this 281 trillion in new financial assets. This is a major problem that the market doesn't understand. And when you add the financial assets before 2007, it's over 500 trillion. It's all kind of assets. It's stocks, it's bonds, it is pension funds, it's mutual funds, it's money market accounts. That's all finance. Because at some point in time, the person who owns that financial asset, whatever it is, it's a casino chip that they want to cash in and buy something. And that's going to be very inflationary. So we just don't have the energy is just there to produce the GDP. And unfortunately, the massive debt increase, the massive increase in financial assets, this is very problematic. I don't have the solutions, but what I talk about and what I kind of share with my subscribers is the common sense approach. Stocks, bonds, and real estate aren't stores of value. They're energy IOUs. A 10-year bond is based on 10 years of economic activity to pay back that bond.
So I'm just okay. So it looks like you're saying in the previous slide that it's like we're in a big bubble.
Yeah, let's go back.
Yeah. So is this? So it looks like it's 10 times more in financial assets, and so if they're not able, if we run out of oil, then will the financial assets decline? Do you think in tandem, like 10 times?
Well, I've got a chart I'll show you.
Okay.
I call it the global Bear Stearns Lehman Brothers event. That's what I call it.
Oh, okay.
And you see, the reason for that is we're paying over, and maybe you all know this, we're paying over $1 trillion now to service our debt for the United States Treasury. $1 trillion, based on the interest rates. And they've got to roll over about half of that, which is there's like 26 trillion now in outstanding treasuries. They got to roll over about half of that this year. So if they do that and interest rates really don't come down from the Fed doesn't lower the Fed funds rate, then we're going to see an even higher amount of interest expense. And so the problem is this. It's going to get to the point where I don't think you have to have a major decline in energy global oil production. You just can't grow. Because now if you're not growing, then these assets become very problematic. And we're seeing that with the pension funds. They need to grow 7% a year. And so they're in trouble because they invested in a lot of risky assets over the last decade. We're talking, I can't think of all these terms, but private equity, and all these things they're cannibalizing the financial system to provide a yield. And so we've been doing that. So even if we plateau and start to decline, that to me is going to be enough leverage to start pulling down these financial assets. So that's how I see it, because again, we only have the energy to do the goods and services. We don't have all the energy to settle all that out there. And unfortunately, the market doesn't understand it, because I call it, they believe in the energy tooth fairy. And that's what the economic profession is based on. They don't base it on energy. So when you understand that this finance is really an energy IOU in the future, if you have growth, then you can continue to make it a Ponzi scheme. You can continue to grow, but it's still going to come down at some point. But if you start to peak and decline, I believe gold and silver are the better stores of value in the future, because they store this energy equivalent value. It's already locked in that gold and silver coin. A bond doesn't lock it in. The bond is based on the 10 years. A 10-year bond is based on 10 years of future energy production, consumption, and economic growth. A gold coin is based on the energy that was invested and spent in the past.
Yeah.
And it's held now in that gold coin, the value of it. So it's a new concept I've come up with over the last several years, understanding, because no one really tells you about it. No one goes back in history and finds out what we used energy, and no one really understands what the value of assets are based on. They're based on energy. They have always been. And we just think they're going to continue to go up forever, because we don't understand that this energy can't continue. You can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. So getting to the answer you're asking me, I showed this chart in the Solar Symposium, people think that the collapse of Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers happened right here. All of a sudden, even Jim Cramer, on CNBC was talking, even right before, a week or two before the collapse of Bear Stearns, that you should invest in Bear Stearns. And so this is the insanity towards the end. I'm suggesting the collapse and death of Bear Stearns happened years before. They were setting up. The market just didn't know it. And so what you have is kind of the market continues to churn, and then the reality hits, and then the thing collapses. That's kind of what I see happening. I can't tell you how it happens, in what level, how quickly, but this is what makes sense to me. And I think my analysis, if you look at the energy production and you think we're going to start peaking and declining, the financial assets are in serious trouble because we don't have the energy to settle them. So right now, these financial assets, if I had to put a number, they're worth 10% right now. At most, 10, 15% at most. Because again, we only have enough energy to provide the goods and services. We can't, because if you have to remember, it's 80 trillion or 90 trillion in GDP. There is 500 trillion in financial assets that someone wants to sell that asset and buy something of GDP, something, right? So that's 5 times the amount of financial assets, 5 years worth of GDP. So this is how much of a Ponzi scheme. And the reason why oil and gold have been behaving a certain way, I showed the decade average oil price versus the silver price from the 1900s. It's based on the prices of oil. It's simple. Simple. It's based on the price of oil. However, going forward, I base the value of metals, the precious metals, not on their cost of production, which they are being based on. Mostly. My analysis is 1650, 1700 total cost to produce gold now. That's what it costs. So if you want to buy gold, you're going to have to pay the gold mining company that much to produce it, even though there's a lot of gold still held in inventory. That's just the way it's been for 50 years or more. Silver, right now, it's 20, 22, 23. That's what it is now. And the issue going forward, let me see if I've got, okay, this is the last slide. So going forward, I believe we're going to see a transition. As more investors wake up, the problem we're having with energy, it's going to negatively impact finance and even real estate. So to protect your wealth, that's what people want to do, is protect their wealth. They're going to have to get into real, physical, sound assets. And gold and silver have proved themselves over thousands of years as other assets too. But when you start to see this funneling of people out of finance into metals, I have no idea what the value is, but that's when I start to see a major, you call it a bull market, but when people were getting out of Bear Stearns, where did they go? They went into other assets, other financial assets. But what happens when people start getting out of financial assets? There's 500 trillion of it. And so this is the problem the world is facing. I'm done with this presentation. Hopefully I didn't overwhelm you. There's a lot of information there that's taken me like 10 years to put together. So I'm done. You want me to stop sharing, or did you want? Okay.
Here, all right. Put us back into chat mode.
Okay, right. I'm sorry, guys, if I threw a lot of information out there.
It was great. Thanks. I
have something to tell you, if it's possible. This is a what do you call it? A denarius.
Yes.
Septimus Severus, 228 to 222. This was a day's wage for a soldier.
Wow.
Kind of cool. And then this is the back is the goddess of virtue, Virtus.
Wow.
Cool?
I don't even have an ancient silver coin, so that's impressive. It's
the only one I have. Yeah. It's the only ancient silver coin I have, but I thought it was kind of fun that there he is, staring out of history.
Wow. And which emperor was that?
This is Septimus Severus. He loved his mother and the arts. But anyway, they sent him up to, I don't know, the battle of the Germanic hordes or something, and I'm afraid he was kind of killed. Anyway,
I
did that a lot. They did that a lot, you know. But I think it's a silver coin from back in that time, you know, probably made out of Spanish silver.
Mm-hmm.
How
Probably
much
made
were
of
they adding
Spanish.
other things like lead into those things at that time?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you know what's
the
interesting?
composition of the silver?
I'm sorry. Repeat that.
I was just wondering if you know the composition of the silver, like how much other additives were in there at that point in time, given
by
Steve's idea of the collapse, and so they were mixing other chemicals, other elements in with it.
28 AD. I'll bet it was only like 50% by that point. I'm not sure.
Yeah, about 200 AD, it was 50, but by 250, it collapsed down to like in the single digits.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you see, that's kind of how things play out. So, and if you look at a real long chart, so when I talk about collapse, I'm not talking about tomorrow or next week or next month or next year. Collapse is decades. And so, but yeah, it is one thing that you would find interesting. People say, well, Steve, they were mining a lot of silver. Well, shouldn't that just kept adding to the hoard? The issue is Patterson did a study on how much silver was lost back then. And even now, and he did an estimate from like 1850 to 1920, people using silver coins, we lost 1 billion ounces of it. Just lost. We lose $65 million of coins. U.S. citizens lose 65 million ounces of dollars of coins a year. Gone. We throw it away. It's just gone. And so what people don't realize, if you use currency, silver or gold currency, it gets lost. And so they were replacing a lot of lost silver, not only in shipwrecks or being stolen, but they also lost silver that was just lost. And they're finding silver now, right? They're finding old pots of silver that were in farmers' soil. So very interesting dynamic.
Here's 250. By 250, this is you can see it looks like a lot more like a copper coin.
Yeah, there's a lot of copper in that.
And it's just barely, it's all worn down. So.
Oh wow! So is that a second coin?
We've done the same thing. Instead of decreasing the amount of silver or gold, we've added more finance. Yeah. We've done it with digital and paper finance. So instead of having that collapse look, we had the exact opposite, which I showed you in the increase in financial assets. Financial assets are also digital assets, digital money, and so. Yeah, it's an amazing thing. Go ahead, Andre.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up that there's well-known correlation that whenever Rome or anyone else declines, the amount of coin hoards increases. Like where they find silver coins in a pot underground. So lots of people have had the same idea all through history of let's accumulate a bunch of coins. And I mean, I guess it might have worked for some people, but obviously for a lot of people, we found the coins. So they didn't get to them.
Yeah. Buried in our backyard.
Yeah. And I know like there's kind of So what I generally pursue is more community, because you really need to have a good community. And so I would be more into, I guess you could say, the real estate, but it's more like community estate. Because it's like if you buy real estate, there's no guarantee you'll be able to defend it if society collapses. So it'll be worthless. But if you have a community of like-minded people, then it could work. But I know, interestingly, that almost all secular intentional community attempts have failed. And only the ones that really have a spiritual element have had any success. And the most successful have been the Anabaptists, which is like the Mennonites and the Amish and things like that.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point. I think they're going to do fine. They're going to do better as time goes on. And with my subscribers, I don't see a Mad Max happening. I'm not saying you can't. A lot of people, we have anxiety. A lot of people don't even look at what's happening in the world. They just get up, they go to work, and so their anxiety is their day-to-day anxiety from work, paying bills. But when you start looking at the numbers, and I know you've had Simon Michow on many times.
Yep.
So he puts out a lot of good information at the numbers and good ballparks. So I think we're getting ready to peak. And so what does that mean for and you saw that first chart I showed you. I mean, we went up exponentially. So, but I do think we're going to be in a plateau we could be in a plateau for 5 or more years due to throwing NGLs and even, what's interesting about Alberta oil sands? I've got a chart showing.
I call them tar sands, but okay, go ahead.
Tar sands. I call them tar sands too. It takes, for every 1 million barrels a day of tar sands production, they burn 1 billion cubic feet a day of natural gas. And they get that from the shale gas field. And so you need that gas to burn that oil, to produce the oil. And so even though people think, some people think we'll put a nuclear power plant. To me, that's one of the stupidest things to do. But so I think these issues going forward are, I think Mennonites and people who live in farming areas and more rural, I think the biggest cities are going to be the most problematic. But I don't see a major collapse happening overnight, because when Bear Stearns collapsed and Lehman Brothers collapsed, we didn't have the end of the world, right? We didn't have the end of the world. And so I think even though we can have, like we had the pandemic shutdown, wasn't the end of the world, and there's a lot of discussion about that, but you would think by cutting 15 million barrels a day of production would have really impacted everything. It did briefly, but.
Mm-hmm.
So I see your chart here.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah. This is I was going to show some of my slides, but first I wanted to get to the YouTube questions here. Well, there's just a couple here. They wanted to ask about the future of metallurgical coal. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Okay. China produces most of the coal. 50% of the coal in the world is produced out of China. And so that's why they have become the economic superpower in the world for producing goods. The issue is, how do you get that coal? Do you have energy tooth fairies, mining that coal? No, you've got diesel equipment and they're extracting coal. And then what do you do with that coal? You have to transport the coal. Well, they use trucks and trains and ships to transport coal all around diesel. So China has been able to ramp up their coal production as well as the rest of the world due to diesel. So the issue is, we still have coal. We would still be able to maybe ramp up coal more if we need more electric power coal production. We could do that. But when you start declining in diesel production, common sense says you're going to have less coal production, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And June has a question.
Yeah, I did pose some questions earlier on before the chat started. And I guess going back to your presentation, Steve, basically peak oil is going to cause financial collapse, isn't it? That's what you're basically saying.
Yes.
If we get it severely, and that financial collapse could be like Bear Stearns. So, the idea that collapse is not going to be fast, it's going to be a gradual thing over years, may not be true. And yes. From that, we have this question about the actual reserves and also the reserves of diesel, which you just touched on.
That's right.
My question is, now how much diesel is there in the shale oil? And also, if you add the tar sands to the shale oil, some sort of a mix, can you get more diesel out by doing that? And in other words, in the refinery process.
Yeah, I do know that they mix the oil sands with the shale tight oil, and it makes sense. And now the EIA is doing transfers to oil supply. It's a new, I call it hedonic adjustment. They're adding natural gas liquids now to U.S. oil production, which makes it 13.3 million barrels a day. So they're adding 600,000 to 700,000 barrels a day now of miscellaneous and NGLs, which I think is kind of it's not really oil, but it's petroleum. The issue with shale tight oil and tar sands the tar sands will have a diesel component in it. The shale oil doesn't produce as much diesel, and natural gas liquids do not produce a lot of diesel or jet fuel. And so it's very expensive to do that, and they're not doing that. And so I think we're going to peak in diesel first. But it's going to take a little time for that to happen. But that's due to the peak of conventional, even though we can ramp up more heavy oil. And the problem with Venezuela, they don't have a lot of natural gas around there to ramp up their heavy oil like Alberta does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know BC.
Did I answer all your questions? I'm sorry.
I had one question. Have you heard about the recent what do you call it, tightness of diesel supplies? I just read this thing that said that in last January, or even earlier than that, they said we were down to 1951 levels of diesel. You know, the amount that's stored, and there's a storage problem in Europe also.
Well, I think the high prices in 2021, 22 really hurt Europe, and now they cut the nat gas pipeline from Russia, which was a mistake for whatever reason, or it was destroyed. And then they decided they were going to do sanctions and not import oil from Russia, which is also another mistake. The U.S. is unfortunately using Europe as a whipping boy. And that's my analysis of it. And they're going to continue to be hurt. So demand has kind of dropped for diesel consumption. The issue is looking at the data, looking at the numbers. Diesel was getting a little bit tight in the United States about 4 or 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, but it's kind of turned around. The same with gasoline, even though this last number was a bit high, a bit lower. We're right now at the average for the 5-year average. And so globally, oil inventories are low, but the diesel isn't that bad. But I think if we get this recession, U.S. recession, I think we're going to hit a recession, and then globally, then I think it could cut demand, and that could kick the can down the road. We could pull down demand for diesel. That could hold it off for a while. And so, but that's how kind of I see it. I think we're okay with diesel inventories. Look at natural gas. I've been talking about natural gas in the United States to my subscribers. It was going to go below $2, and now it's at $1.70 something. And that's the volatility. It's terrible for the shale gas producers to produce shale gas at $1.70. So it goes up and down. It's going to become extremely more volatile in the years ahead.
I'm wondering what you think of the natural gas reserves. I know it's one of the hardest things for me and John to get any data on.
Well, Jean Leherrera does he does a lot of analysis on oil and natural gas liquids. I know Art Berman does, even Simon. The issue is it's kind of simple too. How do you drill natural gas wells? Well, it takes a lot of trucks moving around, right? Trucks and moving pipe around, and you need diesel to do that. Mm-hmm. So even though I think we'll see a peak in natural gas after a peak in oil, and depends on how much we continue to ramp up unconventional. But I do think natural gas and natural gas liquids will likely peak a few years after oil. But I'm not quite sure. But I do think we have to realize, even though people talk to Steve, there's a lot of silver in the ground, there's a lot of gold in the ground. You got to extract that gold. You got to extract that silver. And so I do think the natural gas inventories that they say they're out there are based upon being able to extract that natural gas based on the diesel supplies.
Yeah, I think well, I was going to show my slides of the current projections.
The forest journey?
Yeah, it was the wrong slide, but
it's okay.
Transition presentation. There it was. Here. It was it's Forest Bird. I accidentally got the wrong. There we go. Okay, so now I'll share it. And then, because I don't know if you're familiar with our projections that we've been sharing here. Okay, can you see it there? In the little window? Yeah, okay.
The 1P, 2P, 3P, yeah.
Yeah. So here, you can see the Rystad Energy data. So we went down by 1.5 years in the proven reserves, and in half a year in the proven reserves, and 1.5 years in the probable reserves. So we have 8.5 years of oil reserves remaining, whether you look at the proven or the probable. If you do the numbers, because there's a 50% probability of extracting the 2P. So, on average, that's about half, with about 5 to 16 years remaining. And then, I show some other stuff related to that. And then here's with the NGLs, and I think you'd be more in this camp over here, with a smoother kind of plateau decline, rather than, say, John Peach was saying that, because of what you were saying with the oil decline of 43%, the U.S. shale, you start with a few large fields, and then they have long tails, and then you have these smaller fields that we can extract faster because of a good technology, and so it could lead to I'm not sure what was the name of that financial company that collapsed.
Oh, Bear Stearns.
Bear Stearns.
And Lehman Brothers, yeah.
And Lehman Brothers. Okay, yeah. So a Bear Stearns style collapse is also possible. Mm-hmm.
That was my question.
Okay. Yeah. So what's your commentary on that?
This is one of these things. When I moved out of a big city back in 2007 because I knew what was going to happen. And so I knew we were going to see what happened in the global financial crisis. I knew was coming, and it was based on the energy. What I did get wrong was how much they were able to ramp up shale production. Many analysts got that wrong. So I've got to keep an open mind. I do put forecasts, and I give it an estimate. But I do think one of the issues is we can continue to push the can down the road. So according to Jean Laherrère, his estimate of backdated reserves is more like 750 billion barrels. Now, I don't know if all that's going to be compared to what you're showing. But looking at the Hubbert Linerization, looking at other linearizations, and maybe even also considering the falling energy return on investment, as I show, it is similar to what you're suggesting. But so I think we can add a lot more of this petroleum supply to kick the can down the road. So it would really be like a cliff. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's 5 years. I don't know if that's 8 years. I don't know if that's 10 years. Or if it's 2 years, I'm not quite sure what that is. But, and unfortunately, there's a lot of waste. There's a heck of a lot of waste in our industry. And so if people had to kind of live still in homes where they live together in one home instead of 4 homes, they live together in one home, we can kind of adapt. I don't know what that would look like. It'd be chaotic. But again, I'm not one that thinks we're going to have a Mad Max collapse overnight. But it's going to be disruptive, and it could be. It's going to be very interesting, and I'm not quite sure how it plays out. But I do think after 2030, it's going to be very disruptive.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So that actually aligns with, like the Hubbert Linerization, which is over here. So 2035, we'll be at the same production levels for conventional as we were in 1965. But our population is much higher, and the limits to growth study also had us on we'd be around here in the decline phase. And another interesting book I read was the Mass Dreams of the Future, where they projected 2,500 people into the future. And so basically the urban environments that were on the surface were like this. This is in 2100. Where they were just for salvage. So embedded energy. So I was saying, like you were saying about the silver and gold, about its embedded energy, and so where we headed the salvage economy. So right now we're in the what do you call it, scarcity industrialism, where things are closing down and shutting down generally, but and people are trying to conserve energy, like you were just saying, with 4 people in a room or whatever. And trying to lower consumption. But then once we're in the salvage economy, then it's going, all the embedded energy is going to be in like these skyscrapers, and then like trying to get to the steel so that you can take it to the country and then make something useful out of it, like farming implements. And so one of the largest, most populous lifestyles they found in the 2100 era was the rustic lifestyle of like the Amish Mennonites. But they had a very hard life, and they only lived to about 56 years on average. And then the survivalist or the indigenous, they actually lived to be about 70, because it's just hunter-gatherers only work like 4 hours a day, and whereas the Amish,
Right.
they work like 12 to 16. So they just the reported reasons for their death was usually died from exhaustion. So it wasn't as bad with the indigenous, but I think they just couldn't keep up because it's a nomadic lifestyle. After 70, it's harder to keep up. And then where's the New Age Sylvan, which is the food forest communities, which is kind of like where I'm focusing my energies, is growing those trees. Like you started your presentation about how deforestation causes drought and things like that. And we actually have a good example of that here in Grey County, in Grey Bruce. Bruce County used to be a desert just a few decades ago, in the 1950s. And what they did is they started planting white pine because it's drought tolerant, and it grows well on sand. There were dunes. There were dunes all the way of Grey County here. I'll show it on a map, just so you guys know what I'm talking about. And then so they, after they planted it, the rainfall started increasing. And then they could farm here again. So this whole area over here was all desert. And after they planted the white pine, the rainfall started again. And now we're getting a meter of rain per year. And now you might not be able to see it as well, but all of these are trees that we're planting. But you see, like this, it's very sandy here. Where so this was all desert before. So yeah. So it is
I imagine, before people moved in there and expanded, that was trees before, correct?
Yeah. It was trees before.
It was a forest.
Yeah, it was a forest before they cut everything out. It's just that when they first settled Owen Sound, they just clear cut everything. And actually, Owen Sound was called Mud Town for a long time because it's surrounded by the Niagara Escarpment. And you see all these ridges here. So every time it would rain, all the mud would just come down all of these ridges and just pour into town. Just like that Troy example you were giving.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And so now we actually have, laws that you can't cut these trees down because they're keeping the mud up there. And so now we don't have any mud landslides or anything like that because all of our ridges are covered in trees.
That sounds wise.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, today there's a lot of intellect. There's a lot of very smart people. I just don't see a lot of wisdom. And so when I went back in history and looked at what happened in the past and go forward, there wasn't wisdom either in these ancient civilizations. It was mostly intellect that made them grow the way they did. And I know there must have been wise elders that try to give advice. Can't keep doing this, but no one listened, and so we're in the same predicament now. But yeah, I mean, China's done a lot of regreening, but they started to, and then now they're cutting back cutting down those trees again because they need them. And so we've been fortunate not to have to use, because a lot of forests in Europe and the United States have grown back because we don't need the wood.
Actually, that's not true. That we're cutting them down at unprecedented rates in order to turn them into pellets to send to Europe, because many of their power stations operate on green biomass. So we're cutting down 1,000-year-old pine nut trees in Colorado and New Mexico and sending them over to be burned in Europe, unfortunately.
No, I agree with you. I've done research on that, but in Europe, they're if you go back 100, 200 years ago and see some of documents, Europe's forests have come back in many places, and even in the United States, but they are cutting down a lot of trees. I'm not saying they're not, but when you look at the overall, because we're using wood, we're using oil, natural gas, and coal, nuclear. France is using nuclear, right? They don't got to cut trees down to heat their food, so they're leaving those forests alone. Even though we are, and there's a lot of it is in the U.S. Southeast. There's a lot of pines being used just for that purpose, cutting them down to make pellets. I've seen it. So I do agree with you. That is happening too.
Mm-hmm. And I got a YouTube question here. What happens if you add climate change to your analysis?
Well, the two aspects of that are, I think a lot of the climate change is not only due to the fossil fuel burning, and people can debate that all day long. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, or it's correct or it's not correct. I think a major component is not understood is the deforestation, because the deforestation has now put a lot of water vapor in the atmosphere, and it's coming down, and either it's coming down in severe floods, or it's very dry. And so not only have we changed, not only are we adding a lot of CO2 and now methane, I think methane's a bigger issue. The problem is now the cutting down of trees, the deforestation is also changing the rain climate.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that point, that my understanding is that we're because of the climate change, we're getting more water in the atmosphere now.
That's true too. Yeah, more water vapor.
Yeah, more water vapor. But what the trees do is they do multiple things that are good. So one of the things that they do is they produce particles that form the water droplets, and so it rains. And so if you have trees, it will rain more often, and then you will be less likely to have one of those massive floods, or lower seasonality. Seasonality, like if you have high seasonality, that means that you have a long drought and then a big flood. Now, if you have a bunch of trees, it lowers seasonality so that you have, say, multiple rainfalls instead of one big rainfall. And then when the water does fall, the trees, they can soak up that water and help contain it. And then they also create shade to prevent that water from evaporating back up. And so there's so many good things about trees that many people just don't know. Ivor? Mm-hmm.
Well, there's this thing called the Biotic Pump. Have you heard about that? And what that does is, I actually see it every summer, is the water comes up off the ocean and goes up to, they say, hundreds of miles inland. And then when it gets to where trees are, it drops. And it's a sort of a constant pump. And I watch thunderclouds forming. I live on a small island in the summer, and I watch the thunderclouds form, but they don't get down to the island where we live because they're up in those trees. And when I lived in Guatemala, I used to, I had this Mayan guy said, trees call the water. And I thought, oh yeah, right. Trees call the water, right? And as it turns out, he was right. The trees call the water, and he was complaining about people cutting down trees because it's getting drier, but it definitely makes they've proven it that it definitely makes a difference and makes the rain go way in. So more trees we cut, the less chance we have, agriculture and everything work.
And I believe that biotic pump it was two physicists. They're Russian physicists. One was an older gentleman. He passed away, but it's a woman now, a younger woman who is trying to continue with that biotic pump. And even what's fascinating, Christopher Columbus, in some of his writings, when he went to different tropical islands, he noticed when they were mostly forested, they were early in their Western colonialization. He noticed that there was a mist in the morning, it rained. But when he went to these islands that were cut down, they were growing sugar cane and all that, they were deforested, he noticed there's less rainfall. He even mentioned that. And so he even picked that up 600 years ago, and he was just a ship captain. So, this is nothing new. I think a lot of people have known this for thousands of years. We just forgot the wisdom of these processes.
Mm-hmm. And conversely, planting trees improves your seasonality and the amount of rainfall you get. And so actually they found that by 2500, this New Age Sylvan food forest type community was actually the dominant lifestyle on the planet Earth, because what they were saying is that many of the other places where the New Age Sylvan people were not were all turning into just desert, like wastelands, like we were seeing with those island of Cyprus and the other islands you were showing that were completely denuded. And so basically these food forest people managed to spread throughout the land because they're constantly planting trees and rehabilitating the ecosystem.
Yeah, and if you don't mind me, adding a little bit to that, and you all may know this, but I'll just say it. And the issue is, Spain has been trying to do this. A lot of places have done it successfully, but now, and they're doing it in Israel too. They're replanting forests, because the biblical times, Israel was the land of milk and honey, and now a lot of it's desert. The issue is, when you plant certain trees, especially monoculture trees, which they're doing in Spain, if you do not allow these trees to mature a certain way, and what they're doing now is they're actually using them they're growing the trees, but then they cut them down. The trees have to be a certain kind. They have to be very small, new trees. They have to be medium trees, and then there have to be massive virgin trees that actually are most of the coverage. That kind of a forest, a very diverse, large and small forest, that is what brings the rain. Unfortunately, like in California, there's a lot of trees that are dying. We're seeing millions of acres of dead trees. And so what's happened is these trees now, they're growing, and they're adding trees, and they're sucking a lot of the water. They're not allowing them to mature. And what they do is they pull too much water, and they become too dry. And so it's a very fine line of the way to allow nature to reforest. We are doing it in some places successfully, but some places we're doing it incorrectly, and it's coming back to hurt us. So it's a very complex issue that, like in Southeast United States, if you reforest, it'll probably be fine. But if you try to reforest, like in Italy or Spain, and you don't do it correctly in a semi-arid area, that's when you've got to do it correctly. You could do it incorrectly in a moderately wet area. You cannot do it incorrectly in a semi-arid or arid area.
Yeah. So what do you think is the correct way? My understanding of the correct way for like those deserty regions would be planting plants that are drought tolerant, like bramble wattle and mesquite and all pomegranates. Depending on your hardiness zone, there's many kinds of drought tolerant desert plants that you can grow in a low precipitation area. I know one of the things with China, though they have, they're the highlight is green because they've planted 79 million hectares between 1990 and 2015. But a lot of it was they were planting poplar in the desert. And now poplar grows really fast, but it also needs a lot of water. And so it's not like the best choice for that. So if they had planted, something maybe like bramble wattle and those things that can actually manage in those, I think it would be better.
Yeah, and I don't know what the best way for each location is, and the issue that they're having is because a lot of these semi-arid and arid climates, they had deciduous and conifers. Because during like the winters in certain areas, of course, the deciduous trees are going to lose their leaves. The conifers don't. So the funny thing about the biotic pump, that Ivor brought up is the conifers start bringing the water a little early, and then when the deciduous get their leaves in the early spring, that's when they start to bring the rainfall in. So it's a very complex situation of how to reforest arid or semi-arid areas that are now a desert, because if you look at a lot of this, they're scrub. There's a lot of very small cedar scrub. That's what it is. It's scrub everywhere. And so when you look at that, you think, well, that was always the way it was. But unfortunately, it's very difficult to take that scrub and make it into a forest that was there 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. I don't know how to do that. What's the correct way to do that? And then a lot of people still use animal husbandry, goats and herds and sheep. And if you want to destroy a forest,
goats are the way to go.
Goats will do it quick, because I had goats. And let me tell you, we had a little piece of 1 acre that was totally overgrown. We put 10 goats in there, and within 7-8 months, it was like a lawn. Wow. And they were chewing everything, you know. And so the thing is, they will denude. And unfortunately, with the Romans, the late Bronze Age, with the Greeks and the Romans, what they started, the animal husbandry put it over the edge over the next 1,500, 2,000 years. So the Mediterranean, unfortunately, is and Africa is a mess due to unwise practices of the land. And also climate change. But you're right. I think from what I understand, the Sahara was green like 5,000 or 6,000 years, 7,000 years ago. A lot of the Sahara was green.
Yeah, it had lakes and things like that. Over here, there's the image. And in terms of what you were asking, like, what is the proper way to do it? I think there is a proper way, and it's through food forests, because you need someone to actually live there. Like in most cactus pears can grow in a large variety of climates, even that get fairly cold. I know they grow very well in Australia, but for some reason the Australian government really doesn't like them.
I've got a nice one growing outside my house, and it's in fruit at the moment.
Nice.
Okay.
Very good. And so they're an excellent desert plant, and they're a good source of diabetic resistant fiber or whatever, that it's a source of calories that was used by the indigenous. And then there's also so that's good for the carbohydrates, but the seeds also are high in proteins and fats. And then you have bramble wattle, which is from Australia, and then it's basically a source of peas, and like beans. And then you have what else is good? So you got your carbohydrates and your protein, and then you need a source of fat. And in many desert places, you can grow pistachios, and so they're a source of fat. So for every single kind of region, you can find something that will grow well there, as long as it's above 250 millimeters of annual rainfall, which is like the Chihuahua Desert, and like extreme deserts. Things like that.
I agree with what you're saying. I think, and you probably know this as well, as forests tend to migrate over hundreds and thousands of years. They migrate. They tend to migrate based on the changing climate. Unfortunately, with so many humans, we're not allowing that to happen. And so I think, is it good to do the food forest? I think it's a great idea. But I think the forests that have to come back are what the forests were there before, and then you could supplement it with these other things that humans can use. But it's kind of keep it simple, stupid. Nature put it there. Why not allow what was already there? Because it's funny about Scotland. A lot of Scotland and England is like they call it a green desert. Scotland and England and Ireland, they were all forested at one time. And
and that was actually a political decision, because I read a bunch of books about it, and they were saying that in Scotland and Ireland, basically when the Romans came over, originally the UK, they were growing hazelnuts. They had hazelnuts all over the UK, and that was their staple crop, and it was very reliable. And they actually got before the time of Stonehenge, they tried wheat, but then they abandoned it because it was harder than hazelnuts. But what they found was that the Romans couldn't tax them based on their hazelnuts, and they called them savages, or from Salvicus, which means inhabitants of the forest. And so and then they forced them to cut down all of the trees, and anyone that lived in the forest was a savage and was a them. And then they made people grow grains instead of tubers because they were easier to tax. You could tell. Oh. No. Up.
He'll come back.
Yeah.
There he is.
I'm here. Hey. Yeah, so they were easier to tax, and so when the tax collector would come by, well, they found it easier to tell how much they would be getting. All right. No, you said
that's true. No, you're bringing up great history. And then, when the Roman Empire fell apart, a lot of that went back, because you do see in history this cycle of deforestation, collapse of civilization, or whatever you want to call it, collapse of village area, whatever. And then it goes, then they start back in, and you get deforestation. It was because, the English Empire became big on its iron production. And where did it get its iron production? In 1500 and 1600 and early 1700, was they cut down a massive amount of forests to produce that iron. And it wasn't until they transitioned the technology to use coal to smelt iron, that's when they became a leading empire. And then they didn't have to rely on so much wood. So it is interesting how, you're right, they did that. They did that they did deforest. And so
this guy, Hadrian.
Oh, yeah. Hadrian
built the wall. There he is.
Which wall?
The wall all the way across. He went all the way across Scotland to keep those forest people out. Mm-hmm. There he is, staring at a history.
Yeah.
Chopped up, and basically they had to keep those forest people out, and they built a wall. And we know how walls work. But anyway.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's nice. No, you're right.
Like the wall of China, but the wall of Scotland.
I think this might be Virtus again.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think. And then.
Well, this is fun anyway. That's all I have, really.
Yeah. Gentlemen, just to let you know, I'm so sorry. I've got about 10 more minutes.
Oh, okay.
And I can talk all day long, and I really do enjoy you allowing me to share this. Mm-hmm. I can talk all day long. Maybe we should do it again sometime, but I did have one commitment at the top of the hour.
Fair enough.
If you have any questions, or if you want to share something with me, I'm always willing to listen to.
Yeah, we were planning on ending at 9, but go ahead, Dune.
Yeah, I do have another question, and that is about the reserves of OPEC. You know that in the 80s, suddenly they increased their reserves incredibly without doing any work. And, how much of a lie is that? What's your opinion?
Well, according to Jean Le Herrera, he actually has done backdated OPEC oil reserves, and he also pulls those down. And I think, because I think with Saudi Arabia, what is their number? They grew 100 billion. They're still there, and they continue to go. I think it's anywhere between 200 and 250 billion barrels are overstated just from the Middle East. Now, what's a great book is a book called Too Much by Half, and it's about the coming cut improved oil reserves, and it's from an oil. I'm trying to think of. If you could, would you do me a favor, Andre? Before I go, could you get that up on Amazon? Too Much by Half: The Coming Cut Improved Oil Reserves. I read the book, and
too much by half. This one?
Yes. James
Right.
Dietrich was a petroleum reservoir engineer. Now, what he says in his book, which is fascinating, in the 1990s, there became a battle between the reservoir engineers and the geologists, and the geologists won. And the geologists are good at putting how much oil is down there, really not how much oil can be extracted using the engineering. And that's what James Dietrich, he went all over the world as a contractor. He started out of California, and he went all over the world doing his analysis on how much the reserve was there, and then using certain technology how to get most of that oil out. And he found out, as he started doing more and more traveling in the 1990s, he retired, I think, in the early 2000s. He found out that if the company that hired him also had a geologist, they didn't go by his analysis. He said there had to be a footnote, a clause where he could get out, because that is the issue. And so what he thinks, there's a lot of reserves that are overstated due to what the geologists are saying, not to what is really economic and technically able to extract. So that's an excellent book to read as well. So I do think the 1.7 trillion of Rystad's total reserves out there, not including methane hydrates and all that stuff, but the 1.7 they say, I think it's actually closer to the 750 billion barrels of proven reserves. And the numbers that you say, if we're going into that energy cliff and finance really gets into trouble, or your numbers could be more accurate. So I'm open to all those things.
I know John Peach, his analysis.
Oh, wait a second. I'm so sorry. I see 285.
Yeah.
What is this right here, Andrew? You say 285 and 505. What are those?
So this is the proven. The proven, which is 90% probability of extraction, is 285. Now the 2P numbers, which are the backdated numbers that your friend Harari was talking about. So this is the Rystad numbers, 505. John Peach, he didn't take out the artificial increase, and I think his is closer to 550. Now your friend would have the highest estimate for the probable reserves, and then the 2 PCS. So you see over here, there's these numbers, because they were trying to figure out how BP came up with this number 1.624, and so they explain over here what all these numbers mean. And
I see.
And so basically the 2PC, so the 1P is just proved oil, the 2P is proved plus probable, and then the 2PC is proved plus probable plus yet undecided projects, and including non-commercial volumes. Okay, and that's the 124 number over there. And then the 2PCX is most likely estimate including undiscovered fields. So it's speculative. And so that speculative number is what they often, like on World Statista or whatever, Statista oil reserves, they're going to say that's the proven.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so here.
One point. What is the number? 1.56. So yeah, and so I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. Yeah,
the undiscovered stuff.
Yeah, that's the big question mark. And so I guess to conclude, I don't have a problem with your numbers. The 505 or 550. I know Jean was saying 750 plus or minus. I think the issue is we never know. It's like I had no idea we would get up to 8.5 million barrels a day of shale type production. I didn't think we would get that high. And a lot of analysts like Jean and other analysts, they thought maybe 4 or 5. Well, we got up to 8.5. And then there's the long tail. you've got the big decline, the first year decline, and then you have to continue to put those on top of each year. That's a fat tail, and just like that. And so what happens is the 45% decline rate 3 years ago is now like 43, and then this year it'll be 41, and then it declines slower, and then you get that fat tail. So what I'm saying is we can't underestimate how much the world can kind of kick the can down the road, because I could be very confident and say, it's going to be this number, but I got that wrong. I totally got the shale. I got it off by almost 50%. I didn't think we would reach 8.5 million barrels a day. And so what am I missing, or what are we missing in the other parts of the world? So that's why I say after 2025, and then there could be a plateau for a while, and then it really starts to decline. You get any giant exogenous event happening, any pandemic 2.0, financial collapse, yeah, it could change. It could change things. It certainly could. So I'm definitely open to that too.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess you needed to go. So
I do, and thank you guys, and I hope that information kind of. You all seem to know what's going on, but at least now we understand that it's always been about the energy. It's just always been about energy. A lot of people forgot it was all about the wood up until 1700.
I just had one last question. If you had a comment on this, oil price depends on money supply graphic that I found. Are you aware of this? The credit cycle and global money supply drive oil prices. So if there's a large amount of low interest rates lead to high money supply and high oil prices, and then we have high interest rates, it lowers the oil prices.
I think more recently it makes a lot of sense. You go back to 1970 to 1980. I looked at the U.S. money supply, and we were the main dog. It wasn't the rest of the world really, like China. China added a lot of the money supply in the last several years, since 2007. They added a large percentage of the money supply, China did. But if you go back from 1970 to 1980 and you look at the M2 money supply, it really didn't increase that much compared to the oil price. And what's interesting, the oil price went from $1.80 to 36 in 1980, which is about 15 times. Ironically, gold price went up 15 times, average, and silver price went up 16 times. So I do think money supply will impact the energy price, right? It does, but it did not do that in the 70s for various reasons. And I'm still looking into, and I think in 2008, that big increase in the money supply.
Yeah.
But you know something? We also have to consider that's when conventional peaked in 2000 and 2006.
2000, over here.
5, 6. That's when conventional peaked.
But you see, the prices were low, and the money supply was low. So.
But
the oil price
definitely
was
correct.
Medium. Yeah. So there's a interesting correlation there. Yeah. Well, all right. So.
And I think we're going to get this tight. We're getting this tightness, right, due to the high interest rates. And I do think they're doing that also to cut demand. I think many of those people up in government may not understand these energy issues, but I think some do. I think some do understand these energy issues. So how do you destroy demand? You do these things. I'm not saying I agree with what they're doing, but that's what they think they can do. And so, but then they're going to come back and they're going to do that QE again. And so that credit creation is going to be, we're going to get the deflation now, which again, you've got $1.73 natural gas price in the U.S., Henry Hub, and you're in the 70s now for oil. I still think we could go lower, but then again, it turns back around again. It's very volatile. It's like a massive EKG on a very sick patient. It's up and down. And so I think you're right. I think the money supply change in the money supply can definitely impact the oil price, and it will. And it will impact commodity prices too.
All right. So we're having Simon Michaud on next week, but it's going to be a European time zone, and then but we're going to have another Beak Coil chat next month, most likely, and you're welcome to join us. Yeah. All right. So
thank you so much. It was really great. I've been watching your, especially your latest one is really great on
good.
YouTube. Love it. Yeah.
I try to, keep it simple, stupid as much as I can. You have to have enough information you got to have enough information to make sense. But when you see how it all, that's the one thing. And one thing I try to be good at is how all these things connect. Because the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, and that's over specialization. A lot of people in one industry don't really understand what's happening in the other. So what I try to do is put it all together and make it simple. And so that's my motivation to get up in the morning, is to make these things easily understood. So I do appreciate you allowing me to share it.
Thank you.
All right. So
very much. Really
all right, you guys take care all over the world where you are, and we'll do this. We'll do it again.
We leave you as we found you, in the love and in the light of the one infinite Creator. Go forth, therefore, rejoicing in the power and in the peace of the one infinite Creator. Adonai. All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
All right.